Today is a special format on Silicon Curtain. You will not see our faces because anonymity is an important part of the persona of who I'm interviewing. I'm speaking today to Darth Putin. I was about to say the dark persona of Putin. Putin's persona is already dark. This is a satirical version of Putin and a highly effective one. As this video rolls out, you'll be seeing the extraordinary tweets, incredibly sharp and humorous tweets that have been sent out since the full-scale war began by Darth Putin. But the name behind the alias, we will not be revealing that or any other details at all. But please do enjoy the extraordinary biting humor. And one of the things we're going to be discussing is how humor cuts tyrants down to size. Before we get into it, please make sure you check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video. It's incredibly important for us to help Ukrainians to remain resilient and resist Russian aggression. Darth Putin, I am delighted to welcome you to Silicon Curtain.
Thank you very much. Darth would, of course, ask, who the hell are you calling Parody?
Before we start talking about that, it's probably useful for those people who do not know or have not experienced your satirical work. Where can they find it? In what formats? Because I do believe it's not just on Twitter. And of course, people have been leaving that platform in droves, unfortunately, because it's become a bit of a propaganda cesspit. There are also books and potentially, other ways in which they can really sort of enjoy your output. So give us a bit rundown of that first.
Well, the Twitter account is at Darth Putin KGB, which is where he spends most of his time. There's a Blue Sky account under the same name. We have a podcast and YouTube channel, which has started relatively recently. I have a co-host called Katie Schmatzina, who's a Belarusian dissident, and the podcast YouTube channel are called In the Bunker with Darth Putin. And we put out fairly regular content, interviews with relevant people, and also discussions between the two of us about recent events.
And she's very much from Belarus, hasn't she? I mean, she's not there. She cannot be there. She is under threat of, I would say, fairly unpleasant punishment. She would be arrested, I assume. If
she absolutely can be there. She just can't leave.
Yes.
She's been sentenced to 10 years in absentia for attempting to subvert the Belarusian state. She's also under indictment in Russia for crimes that I don't think have been specified yet. She's currently in DC as a refugee.
Yeah, I mean, it's sensible not going back, but obviously tragic to be parted from friends, family, and the country of your birth. We can only hope that she is able to get back, that Belarus can get shot of their potato czar, or the various names that Ukrainians call him, Potato Führer, and of course Putin himself. I think there are a lot of people now who would be love to see the back of him, including many Russians. Some Russians, of course, would like to see the back of him because they think it would help them to win the war in Ukraine, that he's getting in the way of that. Others simply want to bury their heads in the sand and have a peaceful life and not think about such things. And a small minority, I'm guessing, would actively like to see him deposed and put on trial. What is your motivations, and when did those motivations begin to start? What I assume is quite an intense effort to build this extraordinary profile of Darth Putin.
Well, I opened the account, I think, in November 2012, and it really just started as an experiment and something to have some fun with. I don't have other social media. I knew enough about the Kremlin and Putin himself to be quite clear in my mind as to what he is and what he wants. And if nothing else, you can always just believe what he tells you. So that's when it started.
What he does is satirical enough sometimes just to some of the words.
That's the thing. I'm sure we'll talk about that more. He is desperate to be taken seriously, and is a very small-minded, thin-skinned individual. And I felt that he was being seen in the West as something that he is absolutely not, as this kind of strong leader that is doing good things for Russia, even if he's a little bit tough and blunt. It was shortly after it was some years after the Chechen War, and not too long after the invasion of Georgia, and the beginning of the real crackdown on freedom of press and the taming of the oligarchs, which are two separate things, that I began the account. And I felt that this image that existed of him in the West at the time was very inaccurate, and that perhaps making him a figure of fun would be a way of exposing what he really is to people, rather than just saying things that people don't care about, which is, have you not seen what he did to Chechnya? It was pretty clear to me people don't care about that for reasons that aren't very flattering to most of humanity. Whereas I thought, you can laugh at his topless pictures, of course, but they reflect a slightly deeper and more sinister reflection of the Kremlin and what they're trying to do and how they're trying to present him.
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea of complexity, this idea that, certain people layer onto Putin these, extraordinary characteristics as being a master strategist, which of course is one of the strap lines you use. And he's this master strategist. He's a 5D chess player. He's so many moves ahead of the West, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that the system he's built in Russia is so incredibly sort of complex and sophisticated, you wouldn't really understand it. And that harks back to obviously the Churchill line about Russia being, an enigma wrapped in a mystery, wrapped in a goodness knows what. It seems to me, and we had a bit of a chat in preparation for this. It seems to me that it's not complex at all. It's a very, very simple mechanic at heart. Yes, there's lots of details you can learn, but the fundamental mechanic of Russian power, which affects everything, is not complicated. It's a strong man atop a vertical of power, where everybody beneath that person at the top is really denied any real agency in the system. All they can do is fight for resources and status, and where they can, take each other out. And if you choose to play that game, you have to act like a wolf. And if you choose not to play that game, you're one of the sheep. You're just material for this vertical to consume. Is that too simplistic, or is your understanding of the system not too far off that?
Well, there's two things really, broadly speaking, I think, to unpack there. One is Russia is a very complicated place. It's an enormous country, and it's a very diverse country. And if you want to understand Russia, then potentially there's some merit to what Churchill's quote means. But if you want to understand the Kremlin and what Russia actually wants, specifically from its Western neighbors, then that's really not particularly complicated. Russia wants as much control over the policies of those countries as they can physically get, and that territory of those countries that they feel they should have or need. There's nothing particularly complicated about that. Describing the analogies of Putin that describe him as a chess player or being somehow many moves ahead of his West don't hold up, because he's not a chess player, because there are rules in chess, and Putin operates with the rule that the only rule that constrains him is what stops him. And the only thing that you can't do is that which you're prevented from doing. So he'll do what he can. And he's probably quite surprised that his opponents in the West somehow constrain themselves by quote unquote international law. So he's not a great strategist any more than a mafia leader is a great businessman. There's no particular business sense in holding a gun to someone's head and saying, sign this contract that's very lucrative for me, which is essentially how he negotiates with other countries.
something in the order of an escalatory opportunist.
Yeah. Well, Russia tends to do fairly short intimidations by parking its army across somebody's border and allegedly threatening to invade, although denying that they're going to. But as we're discovering, they tend to do fairly long wars and long occupations. You can ask the Moldovans about that. They've had a strip of their country occupied by Russia for 32 years now. The Georgians, have been occupied for 15 years. And the Ukrainians have been at war with Russia in one form or another for 10 years now. So those are two sort of separate things, really, in that if he's trying to intimidate and coerce a country into a particular behavior, that tends to be a short-term thing. If he actually feels that he can get away with invading, it tends to be a longer-term thing. So it's not a complicated thing to understand, I think, if you put it in that way. And it's never been particularly mysterious because he says what he intends to do. And I think once this particular war is over, or whenever he's gone, people will unpick a lot of his statements and realize that actually he was telling us what he was planning to do for a very long time in advance. One of the major turning points, I think, that probably influenced me in beginning to beginning to focus on him a little bit was his Munich security speech in 2007, where people just sort of pretended that if we just ignore it, it'll go away. I was thinking, this man's the president of a country that has a lot of nuclear weapons, a UN security veto, and he has just said, I intend to limit the foreign policy of the following countries who I don't think should be allowed to join NATO. And people just thought, no, we're not going to do another Cold War. You might not get a choice in the matter, was what I was thinking at the time. And
you didn't just ignore it, though.
A lot of people tried to.
Well, yeah, but we did something else at the same time. We ignored the threat, but we increased our dependency, our energy dependency, on that very entity, that very man and his regime. We pumped hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars into his economy so he could not only, rape his country of its assets, but build up this sort of army, which he thought, of course, would be strong enough to roll over Europe. So at the same time, he's telling us more or less what he's going to do. And if we don't comply, you can assume, what the threat is. And at the same time, we're giving him the resources to do that. This could have gone far worse than it actually has. If Ukraine hadn't formed a buffer and almost, a security umbrella to protect Europe, we could be looking at quite a different scenario. Was that in your mind at this time and through this period when you were building the account up that, we could be seeing something a lot more serious than just a sort of just Ukraine threatened?
Yes. After I'd started the account, it became apparent that he wanted things that we weren't going to be able to give him, partly because they're not ours to give and they're not his to take. He very much wants to, when I talk about controlling the foreign policy of his neighbours, he wants to limit the foreign policy of those countries to the point where the Kremlin describes it as being neutral. What it really means is being pro-Russian. That limits their sovereignty to the degree that the Kremlin feel is necessary, and that is not a situation that can be solved diplomatically within the rules of the game as that we currently accept. I think it's the second sentence of the UN Charter that says countries will have the right to join what organizations they like and be free from coercion and threats in the process. We just didn't seem to think that was something that we obviously as collectively weren't willing to stand up for that right, and he was very clearly aware of that. I think looking back on it, it's probably surprised me just how far he is actually willing to go in order to achieve his foreign policy objectives. I always, at the time, would have probably been asked how he would be willing to stick with limited wars in the sense of against far smaller countries or against countries that the West wouldn't identify as being crucial to their own national security. And certainly probably stop short of the threshold of trying to completely upend the way that the international system works, whereby territorial integrity is supposed to be inviolable, although that principle was gone after 2014. It certainly was gone after 2008. And you could argue it was gone in 1992 when they staged a referendum in Moldova, declared the Transnistrian People's Republic or whatever they call it, but the Kremlin actually stopped short of recognizing it as an international state. But the referendums that took place in the two allegedly breakaway parts of Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the Kremlin, I believe, did actually recognize those as states and gave them diplomatic status where they would recognize passports from those two alleged countries. And the implications of that didn't really sink in at the appropriate levels within our governments of what it specifically means, and policies were not formulated accordingly. And as you say, we continued to buy the rope that they were going to try and use to hang us with by making ourselves to a large degree dependent on their energy. The Germans are particularly catching a lot of flack for this, where their economic model seems to have worked upon cheap energy from Russia, cheap immigrants from Eastern Europe, and then exporting the results to China. And I think they're quite deeply concerned that those three elements have now gone permanently, and they're desperately trying to come up with some sort of situation where they'll get them back. And whether they admit it like this or not, but large parts of the German and European policy establishment are quite content for Eastern Europeans to be condemned to live in Kremlin-controlled dictatorships or be occupied by the Russians in order for that exchange to happen. So to return more directly to your question, I didn't really perceive at the time in 2014 that he would be willing to try and fully occupy Ukraine and completely wipe it off the map. At the time, his mental state was that Ukraine was something in the region of a semi-autonomous region of Russia, but something he was willing to pretend existed as a country and not actually fully take it off the map. He certainly seems to have changed that mindset, and his statements on that are quite clear.
And this is where it's interesting, isn't it, what changed his thinking? Because Putin is known for his caution with the Crimea invasion. That was, exquisitely planned, and it was taking advantage of the weakness of Kiev at that point that had just gone through Maidan, and really wasn't able to mount a response to that. Similarly in Donbass, just the center didn't know what was happening in the periphery, and it was still dealing with the aftermath of Maidan. So these are very calculated moves, and the invasion of Donbass was carried out in this classic hybrid manner, which I would say is quite strategic in a way, or at least it's very opportunistic, but with quite a realistic assessment of its chances of success. So they sort of outsource it to an extent to a bunch of mercenaries. Of course, I'm sure history will show they planted various GRU agents and so on in there to keep the show going, and to make sure the right oligarchs, industrialists, and union leaders and various people were coerced. And if they wouldn't play ball, they were taken to basements. But it's a fairly, I would say, economical way to take territory, to destabilize territory. There's a certain rationality there, political rationality, whether we like it or not. Whereas in the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, all rationality, economic, military, it all goes out of the window, in my view. Despite many of the so-called realist geopolitical types, seeking to justify it as a war that is about territory and resources. They try to rationalize economically. But for me, almost immediately, it takes on the character of a mystical genocidal crusade, and one that is extremely poorly planned. So something seems to have happened in Putin's psyche.
Push back on this slightly on the actions in eastern Ukraine and also in Crimea as being strategic. I would say they were flexible. and that he's always been willing to be flexible. And we're getting into counterfactuals a little bit, but
they're plausibly deniable, aren't they? If they fail,
well, I'd say
literally you can disavow them, and you haven't really lost anything.
They're implausibly deniable, but as you say, if you don't lose anything, if it fails, you haven't really lost anything. I think the question that I would have with the actions in eastern Ukraine is that history can already show that they were GRU operators. Gherkin is in jail at the moment and has admitted that he was involved and it was a GRU operation. And it's worth mentioning that he's in jail for criticizing Putin for not killing Ukrainians effectively enough, rather than for being in jail for saying that it should stop. Simon Sebag
Montefiore. I mean, he's a criminal terrorist murderer. There's no question there.
Yeah, Simon Sebag Montefiore has put forward the argument that if Putin had tried to occupy the entirety of Ukraine in 2014, wrapping it up as some kind of protective measure and then not actually smashing the country to pieces and leaving the institutions that run the country largely in place, he might just have got away with it. His strategic genius has been, prior to 2024, has always been reliance on Western weakness. And on those occasions when the Russians have been punched, they tend to back off. The Turkish have shot down one of their aircraft. The Israelis have shot down one of their aircraft, allegedly accidentally. I've read instances where the Jordanians explained to them quite clearly what the red lines were. The Russians were asking the Jordanians, where are the groups that you're backing in Syria? And the Jordanians said, we're not going to tell you, and if anything happens to them, the gloves will come off. The Americans, of course, killed several hundred Wagner contractors in Syria in that famous engagement, which the Russians were denying. But so there's ample evidence that if you push back, he tends to stop. And to quote Lenin again, if you pushing a bayonet, when you feel resistance, withdraw the bayonet. So the strategy of those things leaving Crimea aside, tended to achieve mixed results, I would say, at best. But to discuss what's happened to him, there was an article in The Guardian shortly after the invasion happened, and I read it because it was written by a Russian author and playwright whose name escapes me at the moment, but it's an excellent article describing him as having been corrupted by power over the years that he's been sitting on the throne, and isolated, has essentially gone mad. He's never been particularly in touch with reality. Angela Merkel was famous for pointing out that he's lost touch with reality. Not that it changed her policy towards him in any way. So what has always been there in terms of this angry resentfulness to the West that he learned at KGB camp has festered and turned putrid over the years, over the extended period of isolation in a bunker, having someone as evil as Patrushev whispering into his ear, and formulated along with only receiving information that is clearly false and reinforces his already warped perceptions, led him to believe that I think he has particularly deep hatred towards Zelenskyy, because one of the things is he's funny at his expense, which I know from experience they don't tolerate particularly well. Two, he's an actor, which in his bizarre view of the world puts him down on the same social strata as street prostitutes. And then thirdly, he's also Jewish, which is just worse in Putin's mind. So he convinced himself that Zelenskyy must be some kind of coke addict that is just a puppet of the West and that Ukrainians would welcome him. So that's, I think, what happened to him, is he just got completely twisted and went mad. And how would you and I, or anybody listening to this, try to put yourself in the position of someone like that who has become so wealthy that he's transcended money? He doesn't think about money in the way you and I do. The idea of having a private jet or a $500 million yacht is just something that he just happens to him. And having the power of life and death, running assassination programs for years and years and being completely unchallenged, and having everybody terrified that slightest raise of an eyebrow will have them and their entire family killed. I mean, how would you and I psychologically manage that and remain normal and empathetic and able to understand the world as it actually is? I don't think any of us can really try to perceive him without taking that into account, and that's led him into the decisions that he's made.
And I read an account that someone had written. I think it might have been in one of Pomerantsev's books, and it was really describing behind the scenes in preparation for a Putin visit. So this is before Bolotnaya in 2012, and just the description there, and it was an interview with somebody who was saying that they weren't really sure about Putin, and they thought they might not really agree with his politics, and he was coming to their workplace, and were they going to do something or say something? And then they described this whole obsequious atmosphere where the place is done up, everyone gets really excited, and and then the presence of the Tsar, the God Tsar, is amongst you, and everyone is awed and hushed into silence and reverential attitude, and hang on his every word, even though when you look at it objectively, the words are mundane. He's a fairly diminutive, uninspiring, mediocre person. Yes, he has a team of scriptwriters, so he can appear extremely well informed and fluid, and he's certainly not stupid, but he lacks imagination. I don't think he has any kind of creative imagination. And what sense of empathy he has is there as part of his KGB training to sense weakness in people. So it's been described that yes, people in his presence will get the sense that he understands them and is listening. But it seems to me that it's part of his training to reflect back to people what they want him to be, almost like some sort of, dark mirror. And it's an extraordinary description, isn't it? Because if, from his perspective, flip it around, every minute of every day and every meeting you have with people, you're placed in this atmosphere of total either enforced adoration or real adoration, that's going to kind of mess you up a little bit, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, I think that's what's happened to him. If it was Peter Pomerantsev, he said he writes extremely well on Putin, and that's a very good description of him. It does lend itself to being satirized quite easily, in the sense that there's this enormous gap between the reality that you and I live in and observable reality. God help me, I've quoted Lenin for the third time now. Facts are stubborn things. And what Darth does is just hold up a mirror, in some cases, between what the Kremlin says and what it does, and what the Kremlin believes and what is actually reality. And in many cases, there's an enormous chasm between the two of them. Occasionally, you have to go so far beyond what they say in order to sound like satire, because they say such completely ludicrous things that it can be hard to parody them, because they're almost parodying themselves.
It makes it slightly easier, but also in some ways makes the satire even more biting when it's you only have to tweak reality rather than really push it too hard.
The other thing is that a big part of their propaganda is to put out alternate forms of reality for different constituents that they are trying to effect. Broadly speaking, they fall into sort of three categories: the sort of extreme right, who believe that he's some kind of bastion of Christian values and conservative bygone era, which I actually think means that's a code word for they see him as a leader who keeps darker skinned people in their place, and they like that. And then there's the kind of various splinters of the far left who see him as a bulwark against anti-imperialism for whatever reason that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And within the right, I suppose, most commonly personified these days by Elon Musk himself is the kind of oligarchic class who want to just return to business as usual and go back to stealing like they used to do. So you can sometimes introduce these three realities. Darth and just introduces them to each other, which is most easily manifested by the fact that part of the Kremlin is saying we're willing for negotiations without pointing out that what they actually are willing for is capitulation and regime change. And of course, that gives the pacifist right a great bit of red meat for them to go on to. Most of them are vegans, so maybe that's not the best analogy. And then you've got the same message in the same day will say that, you know, we're winning and annihilating the Ukrainian army and we're not going to negotiate because we're winning. So, and that gets the Z-heads, turbo-patriots going because they're about to capture some completely strategic, absolutely war-changing pile of rubble that can't be pronounced and that nobody had heard of last week, and is the 10th in a row of these strategic war-changing efforts. So you mentioned earlier on that it might take a lot of effort. Actually, I'm lucky in the sense that it doesn't. I've sort of learned how to do it, and also it kind of writes itself once you know how they think.
And we've both chosen words as our weapon in response to Russian revanchism, Russian imperialism, aggression, and genocide, essentially. And I think we both share something else, is that, you know, our experience and reading on Russia gave us a sort of heads up that something like this was coming. And I think we were probably sort of, you know, thinking about the same things at the same kind of time. For me, it was the experience of actually not just reading about Russian history, but obviously spending a considerable part of the 90s living, traveling, and studying there. But we've chosen words as our weapons to respond to this. You've chosen satire, and I've chosen, you know, in a word, storytelling, I think is what I could describe as what I do. Storytelling, you know, it's in the interview format, but essentially it's creating alternative realities, or creating alternative stories for people to inhabit, so they don't have to inhabit the propagandistic stories that are told. For me, this is a battle of who can tell the most compelling story. And I think as we try to overcome propaganda and the exponential growth that we will see in coming years of toxic propaganda with the use of AI and various malicious actors, I think effective storytelling is one of our only weapons. Yours is a particularly, I would say, sharpened, effective pen, because satire punctures pomposity. Satire is a huge threat to those in power. I mean, I'll ping it over to you in a second, but just to use one example, one of Putin's very, very first actions was to put one of his mates in charge of the leading independent TV network in Russia. That was called NTV. And it was actually earlier on than I thought. It was 2002. He started to take that organization apart, yes, because of its critical coverage of the Second Chechen War. He didn't like that, but I think he could cope with that. What he really didn't like was the satirical puppet show called Kukli. And in February of 2000, during the election cycle, they created a puppet of Putin called Little Zakis, and it was based on a story of E.T.A. Hoffman, Little Zakis called Cinnabar, in which blindness causes these ignorant villages to mistake an evil gnome for a beautiful youth. And of course, the evil gnome was Putin. He didn't like that, apparently. And, it's quite something to disembowel an entire TV network because you don't like being satirized. But I think this is an important point, and this should have sent alarm bells ringing way back in 2002. I'd love to hear your view on that, but also why you think satire is such an effective weapon against the pomposity of tyrants.
Well, yes, thank you. He certainly does have a very thin skin and no ability to laugh at himself. And I very much suspect he was teased for his height when he was younger. There was a very kind review of my first book, which described humor as a subversive weapon against propaganda. There's, I think, two reasons it's effective. One is they just simply don't like being laughed at, and they're desperate to be taken seriously, because if you put yourself into his position, he's kind of got broadly speaking, two ways of looking at Russia, which is as a kind of not fully developed country where a large percentage of people live in very primitive and substandard conditions. The road network is so bad you can't drive from one end of the country to the other unless you have an extremely well-equipped four-wheel drive. But it does have what he thinks is a very, very, very capable military upon which they spent a lot of money on. So you either have to realize, look at the reasons why Russia is in the state that it's in and accept them in terms of reality, or you can manufacture an enemy that you have to blame everything on. So they want that to be taken seriously. They want people to actually think, NATO is an aggressive alliance because NATO tried to stop a genocide in the former Yugoslavia, and that was bad, apparently. And it would have been better to just leave the Serbians to be left uninterrupted to butcher as many of the people as they possibly could, because the last thing we want is NATO being imperialist. So they have to believe this kind of stuff. Otherwise, I think that Putin would have a mental breakdown if he somehow denied the ability to believe it. Secondly, the reason it's effective is that they're used to stopping arguments by saying things like, what about Iraq, or what about Yugoslavia? And that, by taking those arguments seriously and treating them as worthy of being dealt with and debated, gives them credibility that they don't actually deserve. It was one of the first things that I believe happens when you get into a cult with its propaganda, is that they try and annihilate the concept of having nuance. You have to disregard that and blindly follow whichever particular trope happens to be the popular one for today. And it can change quite quickly. And which was seen when it became the war isn't going to happen. It's Western propaganda switched inside about 6 hours to the war was inevitable because of NATO expansion. Or enlargement. They never actually asked, why is NATO so popular with all of Russia's eastern neighbors, Western neighbors. So by laughing at it, you take away the one thing they desperately want, which is to be taken seriously, and just making them figures of fun who are peddling lies and bombast, or whatever the posh word for it is. And they desperately hate that. They really, really hate that. So when they say things like Western special services are involved in the poisoning of Navalny, they're hoping that you will go through a point-by-point rebuttal of why that isn't the case, because then they can argue and question the sources of every single thing that you use. Whereas if you just point out that you're actually suggesting that Russia's so incompetent that there are CIA hit squads running around Siberia using synthetic copies of Russian nerve agents under the nose of somebody that you say is being monitored, and this is all because the West somehow think they're going to overthrow Putin by killing his most prominent opponent. That's just ridiculous. And that's a more complicated example of it, I suppose, but that's why it's effective. You're not afraid of something you're laughing at, and that is ultimately, I think, what it boils down to.
And fear is an interesting thing, isn't it? Because Putin came out at various points, and so did many in his circle, Lavrov, Peskov, and all the other sort of rather toxic clowns that keep popping up on our screens. They came out with the line that a world in which there's no Russia is not a world that's worth saving. I think the quote went something along those lines. I've come to think that actually what they meant is something different, which is a world in which Russia is not feared. Is a world which is not worth saving. And of course, what Ukraine has shown is that despite the daily brutality, and indeed, the last 30 days has seen really the highest levels of casualties among civilians since the first sort of genocidal weeks of the war, extraordinary and appalling carnage. Despite all of that, Ukrainians have shown that they are not afraid of Russia, and they're not afraid to strike back in the most inventive and courageous ways. This also is a primary challenge to Putin's persona and how he wants to be perceived, I think.
Very much, yeah. There's one of the reasons I think they say that is that they trying to create this sense of inevitability. People started to talk about this, that a lot of think tankers are now having trouble with the fact that this narrative that the Russians have quite successfully created, that it's just too big to be defeated and you might as well make a peace now before it gets worse, ignores a great deal of post-World War II history where nuclear-armed superpowers quite frequently lost wars against smaller countries. This is something else that Darth does, which is to pierce people for not having the same moral consistency that they did in some cases, the older ones, thinking of Chomsky, and certainly many of their fathers had over Vietnam, which in some ways is an entirely reasonable parallel. A small country that was trying to keep its territorial integrity and, as they see it, independence and the right to choose what governments they want from a very large nuclear-armed country run by a madman like Richard Nixon. And yet they won, and the world didn't disintegrate into nuclear Armageddon afterwards. Somehow it's only when Russia's doing it that we need to consider the possibility of the entire planet being exterminated in a nuclear holocaust, which itself implies a great deal about the nature of the Russian regime. And exposes it. You can get into other layers where it's the anniversary of the destruction of the dam is coming up. I think, is it the second year of it that it happened, or is it the first anniversary of that dam being blown up? Where they will be denying that Russia had anything to do with it, which is ludicrous. But the same people will be saying we need to appease Russia because they might end humanity in a nuclear war, but they're too nice to blow up a dam. So instead of arguing with them point by point over the fact that Russia was occupying the area where the dam was held and why would Ukraine blow up its own dam in order to slow its own advance down, and trying to point by point refute it with open source intelligence and satellite maps and stuff to present facts that these people just aren't gonna accept, turn their own arguments against them. That's exactly it. Your arguments are that Russia will end humanity in a nuclear war and we need to appease them now, but Russia's too nice to blow up a dam. You're an idiot, and that they can't handle that. So, but to return to the kind of broader question, that the Ukrainians are actually demonstrating something that history has shown before, that when a country has decided that they have to fight because their very existence is at stake, which was the case with the Vietnamese people, then they will fight. And it doesn't matter if it's a nuclear power. That Russia lost in Afghanistan. Russia's military track record is not good when you look at it in the longer term. So we're not seeing, in some ways, anything particularly new. We're just seeing new ways of achieving it. And that's the lesson the Ukrainians are very admirably demonstrating to the world at the moment.
And of course, we are potentially rather slow at reacting, in fact, far slower than we ought to be. I know that some people will push back on that and say, yes, but what about this? What about that? What about, not moving too quickly? And there's a great example, which is this week, which it seems that finally Ukraine is going to be given permission to use ATACMS and Storm Shadow on the territory of Russia. But here we are, signaling in big neon letters, here it comes, Russia, get your stuff out of the way. And I think it's still important because it means that it's going to be that much more difficult potentially for Russians to retake Kursk. And without some form of mobilization, I think they'll be very hard put to do that anyway. And potentially Ukraine may be able to make further advances there, further humiliating the Tsar. Well, we'll come to that in a minute, because that in itself is an interesting kind of effect that we've got out of that. But here we are signaling in huge letters, so we don't scare Russia, so we don't trigger them into pushing a button or doing something. Or, if you're going to be really cynical, we are according them the respect that a superpower deserves. We're informing them, we're communicating with them, rather than doing what the Ukrainians did in Kursk, which is not tell your adversaries and not tell your allies what you're going to do, and use the real arts of military capability, which is surprise, discretion, and hitting them with overwhelming force. We just don't seem to get that at this point, or we're so coerced into fearing Russia that we won't allow Ukrainians to fight with the gloves off.
Yeah, I think the statement that a world without Russia is not worth one living in that they made was fairly calculated. That if we think the Russian Federation is going to break up, which we think if we don't get what we want, we'll use nukes. It has been a long and very calculated set of messaging, and it's put out in conjunction with, as I said earlier, with overtures for peace allegedly. At the same time, and it has certainly had the intended effect upon our policymakers, who have decided, for whatever reason, that this is a real risk and that it's not going to happen on their watch. The counter argument I would give is both the Indians and the Chinese, more importantly, have told Putin very explicitly, and they did this, I think, at a meeting in Astana a year or so ago, that this is not a world in which nuclear weapons can be used, and the nuclear threatening has to stop. And I would be interested in asking these people, what particular insights into Russian behavior do you have that makes you think that Putin will just ignore Xi's very clear direction and use the nuclear weapon and break that taboo? And I would be surprised if there's anything like a coherent answer, because nobody that I know of is particularly asking anybody in policy that question. Why do you think that he would use it, despite being told by the Chinese not to use it? Never mind being told that NATO would then likely become directly involved in the war and start destroying Russian assets within the legal borders of Ukraine.
I rather suspect there are back channels and discussions that have taken place even prior to the starting of the war. There's been some articles written about it. I think we need more evidence to say that they're true, but it does seem that there may be some sort of backroom deal, which is the Americans saying, okay, well, we won't react if this happens and that happens, but here are our red lines, etc., almost giving a green light to the invasion. And that's the allegation. I'm not going to say that it's an actual truth there, but it's also plausible that through these back channels, the US might have said, well, look, if you deploy tactical nuclear weapons or anything in the nuclear realm, then we will, wipe your army from the face of the earth in Ukraine. That has been sort of hinted at as well by spokespeople. So it's implausible to say that we have articulated some red lines. Unfortunately, none of those red lines preserve Ukrainian cities and Ukrainian people, or even really protect the sovereignty of Ukraine. I rather suspect that the US does not have a red line that involves the overrunning of the whole of Ukraine. There is no point at which sort of boots on the ground would be triggered, even if Russia had the capability to actually overrun the entire country. Well, we know that's not the case. But at certain points in 2022, it sort of looked like that might happen. What's your sense there? I mean, you satirize Putin, but there's plenty to satirize on the Allies side as well.
Yeah, a lot of appeasers get duly rinsed by Darth. The problem with what you're describing there is what Western leaders describe as a measured response, and they go out and look very statesmanlike and say we have made a measured response. And the problem with that is the Kremlin owns tape measure, so they will understand what that measured response is and act accordingly. It's not a deterrent. And if, as is quite likely, those discussions that you described have actually taken place, then, as you say, the Russians would have seen it as a green light for the invasion, because they reckon they could have done it without the use of strategic weapons. And it's just a matter of how many casualties it takes, and then they will have won. Certainly, when dealing with the Kremlin, a much more ambiguous response would have been much more useful, rather than articulating what are red lines. So that was very much to go back to my Vietnamese example. One of the things that history has forgotten is that the Soviet Navy kept a ship in Hanoi Harbor for the duration of the war. and made it perfectly clear to the Americans that if a piece of paint was chipped on that ship by American bombing, then that would mean war between the Soviet Union and the United States. That's the kind of response that if we'd have been willing to take that quote unquote risk, I think that a lot of lives would have been saved, because certainly George Bush explained it to the Russians when they were returning Georgian troops from Iraq into Georgia during the war, that they gave them a window saying our aircraft will be landing at Tbilisi airport and we will be returning them. And if anything happens to those aircraft, the full response will be taken place, and it will be the Russian side's fault. And the Russians actually stopped the invasion of Georgia for basically 24 hours to let the Americans do it. So that's the kind of response that will actually deter the Russians and make them act accordingly. It's very easy with hindsight to say that a no-fly zone over Ukraine would have saved a lot of lives, and it's very easy for us to now say that decision should have been made. However, my argument against that is, okay, let's just leave it aside, and there's never any particular consequence for these people that I can see. Their policy decisions have been wrong on red lines on weapons to Ukraine and the effectiveness of those weapons, and different weapon systems were supposed to have been red lines. And you can go back and list all of the weapon systems, starting from simple anti-tank weapons right the way up to the fact that we're now proposing to allow them to use F-16s on Russian territory. And there hasn't been a red line crossed. So where is the consequence for these people who are going to live the rest of their lives in great wealth and privilege? I don't see that. Which is why they're the victims of my satire, for whatever small difference that makes.
Well, I was going to ask about the impact. There's sort of two questions. The first one, let's end on the sort of impact. The first, the penultimate question here, it really leads from what you've said there about, Russia. Putin has said that Russia has no borders, and he had a kind of ironic smirk whenever he says this. I remember on stage, he's explained to some kind of schoolboy about this. Россия нет границ.
Yeah, it's a double meaning. Yeah,
it's a double meaning, isn't it? I think Zelenskyy has taken that and gone, okay. All right, this is like the Wagnerites. What, you don't have any Wagnerites in the area? Right, so you're fine if we just literally erase everything in that sort of square mile. And I think Zelensky's on, okay, you don't have any borders. Fantastic, thank you. Right, let's get on with it. And Kursk has shown that actually the hollowness of Putin's regime, the shallowness of the Muscovite mentality, they don't give a damn about anybody who lives in Belgorod, Bryansk, and Kursk. They literally don't give a damn. And for them, it could be 1 million miles away. It really doesn't matter. What matters more is taking, some piles of ash and rubble in Pokrovsk, because those have propaganda, informational value. Retaking Kursk, yeah, not really. I mean, how are you going to spin that?
I think what's more likely for those citizens is that they'll become the victims in a false flag that they'll try to pin on the Ukrainians. Yeah, there are red lines within the Russian Federation. It's just that we're an extremely long way away from them right now. This kind of, in a sense, ties into NATO's aggressive enlargement, in that the Russian Federation is currently essentially completely undefended from NATO, and that a small NATO expeditionary force could walk to the center of St. Petersburg, and there'd be very little that the Russian military could do to stop them. And the only reason they can actually invade Ukraine is because NATO exists and isn't going to attack them.
And they've known that. I mean, this underpins the Vatnik line that NATO expansion is the threat. They've known all along that NATO is not going to march into their territory.
What they're afraid of NATO is that they don't have to be the Russian Tsar who has to talk to Poland as an equal, or even be threatened by Poland, rather than actually see it as just a small buffer state or even a satellite colony. That's really what they're afraid of. And there are Western appeasers who can be mocked with that particular argument in equal number as there are Russian state officials and Z-heads that can be mocked just as well. And the difference is that I think it's more effective than just quoting the NATO, that it's a defensive alliance that lets countries join voluntarily. Well, yeah, okay, that's fair enough, but it ignores the fact that you use their own arguments against them by being satirical, and that's what satire does, is that it's subversive because it takes their own arguments as they're presented and points them back at them. So these are your own words. And that's why Darth has been blocked by the Russian Foreign Ministry and numerous embassies and diplomats.
Well, that brings us on to impact. I mean, that's absolutely fascinating that they've seen it, they've paid attention, they've been offended, they've expended resources on blocking it. What other impacts has it had? I mean, have there been attempts to, uncover your identity? Have there been any kind of attempts to use sort of black ops? Because I know if you go back prior to full-scale invasion, someone like Jessica Arrow, who wrote, Putin's Trolls, they invested what must have been huge resources to try and destroy her reputation and mental state. Now, of course, there's a lot of people attacking them, so they have to pick and choose their battles. But what have they done in reaction, and what's the impact been on the pro-Ukrainian side as well?
Well, they've tried to hack the account. I've had notices from Twitter itself saying we believe a state-level entity has tried to attack your account. We don't know if they got in or not, but we don't think so. So there's that. I've had threats. They've issued statements to the media about how it's a State Department Soros-funded information operation of Russophobia, apparently quoting themselves to themselves as Russophobic.
Well, I bet you'd love to get a grant from MI6 or whoever on the CIA, but I'm guessing not so much.
Yeah, I'd probably have to run all my posts through a committee, and then they would just lose all of their effect. So there's that. In terms of the effect, so they've certainly reacted to it and shown that it irritates them, and then managed to magnify the effect of it by reacting accordingly, which is entertaining. On the Ukrainian side, the landscape of Ukrainian social media is a little different. So it's limited in that respect, and not all prominent Ukrainians follow the account. There are those who don't for whatever reason. The account's raised some money, so there's that. Which I think has been pretty well received. And there are those, I think, who's, because of course he tweets in English, although occasionally in other languages. I wouldn't want to speak for the Ukrainians themselves. Darth's an acquired taste, and I'm not saying I'm 100% correct on everything I've ever said or done. But generally, I think the reaction is fairly positive.
And where the future, obviously the full-scale war is ongoing. We can't make any prediction about where it will end up. Russia, of course, will not suddenly fix itself. And I think this is something we both have in common. People say, oh, well, what happens when the war is over, and what happens to the podcast and this kind of stuff? My assumption is that Russia will not vanish in a puff of gas and dust. It will remain a problem. It will potentially remain aggressive, and it will certainly remain a basket case for many, many decades. So that's certainly enough for my activities to focus on. Where do you see your activities going and evolving in future vis-a-vis, Darth Putin?
I suppose it depends what happens to my parody. He certainly is unlikely to come out of this particular arrangement with his reputation enhanced, shall we say, no matter how much they spin it. However the future ends for Russian Tsars, it's very rarely a quiet death in their bed. Some medical leave in a sanatorium or a retirement in a closely monitored dacha is quite likely. I have pointed out that the seventh circle of hell will have broadband, so probably keep tweeting about that. As you say, Russia isn't going to suddenly turn into a country that decides it's going to be some kind of large, resource-rich European version of Canada that has excellent relations with all of its Western neighbours and resolves all of its disputes diplomatically and decides that borders can't be changed and that the foreign policy of Ukraine is for the Ukrainians to decide. That's, as you say, very unlikely to happen. I would be surprised if in our lifetime the military-aged men are allowed to cross the Ukrainian border at all, and I can only imagine that it would be possible when it becomes a normal thing for Russian school children to be taken to Bucha and walked through the town and shown what actually happened there, and maybe talk to some of the people who might still be alive back then. I'm not convinced that you and I would ever live to see that. But that's the kind of thing I think that would require Russia's immediate neighbors to decide that it's changed. So whoever replaces him will operate under the same ludicrous assumptions about the world that Putin does. I think what people forget or don't consider is that if Russia were to lose this war, I don't believe it can win it, but let's imagine that Russia suffered a strategic defeat, the army mutinied, and Putin was overthrown. He's not going to be replaced by the Dalai Lama, but whoever does replace him is going to be operating with a very different set of constraints and problems than Putin currently deals with, and is therefore likely, even if they are, if you could imagine it's a more evil person, likely to be constrained in the actions that they can take that would affect us. What I suspect will probably end up happening is a lot of people who are outraged that West has constantly tried to interfere in Russia will be demanding the West starts interfering in Russia.
Or he could have a Darth Patrushev. There's many ways this could end up potentially.
It could. I'm not sure I've got the energy to build it up from scratch again, but I guess react accordingly. But still run the YouTube channel. I'm starting to really enjoy that. Katie's the one in charge. I'm just a front. Got a couple of books in the pipeline that I'm working on. So.
We should definitely plug those. I'm going to put links to those in the description of the video. There are two books of your satirical work in there, and of course, people as they watch this video would have been seeing many examples of those satirical posts. If you like that, there's a lot more in the books, and I definitely encourage people to read those. I very much hope we get to talk again on this subject. And what you're doing is obviously having not just a huge impact, but is a huge boost to the morale of those who are pro-Ukrainian in the way that NATO injects energy into this fight against Vatnik trash as well.
There is no NATO. I've been told that.
Oh, there is no. Definitely not based in Langley, Virginia. Absolutely not. It's been a huge pleasure. I hope people have enjoyed this special episode and hearing the voice behind Darth Putin. It's been a huge pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you.